All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to dive right into the incredibly layered, fascinating history of Taiwan. We're looking at the complete foundation of the island, tracing its path all the way from a rugged frontier to the absolute dynamic society we see today.
So how exactly did a frontier island become a modern democratic powerhouse? Well, understanding Taiwan today means we've got to untangle over 400 years of colonization, resistance, and just rapid, massive transformation. It's really the story of an island constantly caught in the crosshairs of global empires, yet one that ultimately shaped its very own unique destiny.
To keep things structured, we're going to quickly walk through 5 distinct eras: indigenous roots to European rule, the Qing Dynasty and Japanese era, the Republic of China taking control, the tragedy of the White Terror, and finally the rise of modern democracy.
Kicking things off with Part 1, Indigenous Roots to European Rule. Let's start with the island's earliest inhabitants, way before the global maritime powers showed up.
For literally thousands of years, the island was home strictly to diverse Austronesian indigenous tribes. Archaeological records show these groups settled there anywhere from 8 to 15,000 years ago. They lived mostly as hunter-gatherers and farmers, deeply connected to the land and sea. And get this, they operated completely without a central government. Each tribe just had its own system, carefully carving out specific territories for farming, hunting, and sacred grounds.
But, as you know, that isolation couldn't last forever. Driven by the incredibly lucrative global silver trade, the 17th century saw Taiwan rapidly changing hands. The Dutch East India Company arrived down south in 1624, looking for a strategic base to trade with Japan and China. Just a couple of years later, the Spanish built an outpost up north, though the Dutch eventually pushed them right out. This European control held on until 1662, when Qing Dynasty loyalist Zhang Chenggong, often known as Koxinga, fled mainland China, totally defeated the Dutch, and swiftly turned Taiwan into his own military stronghold.
Now, the early Dutch strategy on the island was highly transactional. They desperately needed labor to develop the colony and farm cash crops like rice and sugar, so they actively encouraged Chinese immigration. This was actually the very first large-scale influx of Chinese settlers to Taiwan. To put it bluntly, as one Dutch governor actually did, the Chinese settlers were seen as the only bees on Formosa that give honey. They were the ones generating the essential tax revenue and agricultural output that kept the whole colonial operation afloat. Moving right along to Part 2, the Qing Dynasty and Japanese era. Let's see how global empires completely rewired Taiwan's demographics and infrastructure.
After defeating the Zheng family in 1683, the Qing Dynasty officially annexed Taiwan. And under more than 2 centuries of Qing rule, the island's demographic landscape shifted massively. The population swelled by over 2 million people. What used to be a frontier island mainly inhabited by indigenous tribes completely transformed into a majority Han Chinese settler society. This steady expansion basically pushed the Qing-governed territory to cover the entire western plains of the island.
Then, the geopolitical chessboard shifted dramatically. At the end of the 19th century, following the 1895 Treaty of Shimonoseki, Taiwan was formally ceded to Japan. Historical records brilliantly illustrate how Japan exploited Taiwan's somewhat fragmented pre-colonial identity to establish their rule. Because the island's population was so mixed and really lacked a unified island-wide political order, Japanese administrators found it much easier to lock down their authority compared to other more entrenched colonies. They eventually turned Taiwan into this highly productive showcase of Japanese imperialism.
So Japan governed the island for exactly 50 years, and their approach was really twofold. On one hand, they violently and decisively crushed any early armed resistance, like the short-lived Republic of Formosa. But on the other hand, they aggressively modernized the place. We're talking vital railways, paved roads, and widespread public health infrastructure. They reorganized land ownership and made Taiwan a crucial supplier of rice and sugar for the Japanese Empire. By the latter half of their rule, though, they enforced strict Japanization policies, systematically suppressing local languages and customs to assimilate everyone into loyal subjects of the emperor.
Which brings us to Part 3. The Republic of China takes control. At the end of World War II in 1945, the island changed hands yet again, transferring to the Republic of China led by the Kuomintang, or KMT.
The absolutely crucial point to understand here is the jarring gap between what the locals expected and the stark reality of Chief Executive Qin Yi's administration. The Taiwanese people, who had developed a relatively modern society under Japanese rule, really expected political autonomy and equal treatment from their new government.
Instead, they got centralized authoritarian leadership. Newcomers from the mainland monopolized all the key government jobs, the controlled economy suffered a staggering 100-fold hyperinflation in just a single year, and the military troops were notoriously undisciplined. So that initial disappointment, it very quickly morphed into deep-seated anger. All that pent-up frustration finally exploded over a seemingly small, intensely human incident. On the evening of February 27, 1947, a 40-year-old widow named Lin Chiangmai was selling contraband cigarettes in Taipei. Monopoly Bureau investigators aggressively confiscated her goods and her cash. When she begged them to return her money just so she could buy food, things escalated. An investigator actually struck her in the head with the barrel of his gun, leaving her bleeding profusely right there in the middle of the street.
That sparks Part 4, Tragedy and the White Terror. This brings us to a deeply tragic, pivotal turning point in Taiwan's history.
The rapid escalation of what became known as the 228 incident happened almost overnight. The very next day after the widow was struck, a massive crowd of protesters marched to the Taiwan Province Executive's office demanding justice. Guards opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing and wounding several people. That was the spark. It instantly transformed a local public security dispute into a full-scale, island-wide political rebellion. Citizens started taking over local governments, demanding democratic reforms. In response, the nationalist government sent in military reinforcements from the mainland, crushing the uprising with a sweeping military suppression that resulted in thousands of casualties.
Following their ultimate retreat from mainland China after losing the Civil War in 1949, the KMT declared martial law in Taiwan. This kicked off an era known as the White Terror, and it lasted an astonishing 38 years. For nearly 4 decades, the state completely suspended civil and political liberties. Tens of thousands of perceived dissidents, basically anyone suspected of opposing the government or holding communist sympathies, were imprisoned or executed without proper public trials. Now, according to historical sources, the KMT managed to maintain this top-down dominance by systematically utilizing 4 main mechanisms of control. They didn't just rely on strict military policing and coercion, they actively re-engineered society from the ground up. They used the education system to instill strict party loyalty, aggressively restructured social classes to eliminate opposition, and tried to forge a unified pro-Chinese identity by systematically suppressing local Taiwanese and Aboriginal cultures and languages. And that leads us to our final chapter, Part 5, The Rise of Modern Democracy. Let's examine how the Taiwanese people organically pushed back against this total control, leading to an extraordinary political transformation. Despite the intense restrictions of martial law, a resilient movement emerged called Tangwai. It literally translates to outside the party. Since organizing the official opposition parties was strictly illegal, these activists ran as independents. This was unprecedented, an organized political resistance challenging the single-party state and demanding fundamental democratic reforms from completely within the system. It was incredibly brave work. Through decades of intense struggle, that authoritarian grip finally started to loosen. Major civil rights demonstrations, like the Chengli incident in 1977 and the Formosa incident in 1979, proved that the people's demand for a voice just couldn't be silenced forever. Ultimately, facing mounting internal pressure and shifting global dynamics, the government abolished martial law in 1987. This peaceful, monumental transition paved the way for sweeping democratic reforms, culminating beautifully in the island's first-ever direct presidential election in 1996. Today, Taiwan stands as a thriving, vibrant multi-party democracy. It's a progressive society championing human rights, even becoming the very first in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. Economically, they achieved staggering rapid industrialization, widely known as the Taiwan Miracle, and most impressively for our modern world, Taiwan has positioned itself as an absolutely indispensable global superpower in semiconductor manufacturing. Literally, without Taiwan, the tech in your pocket wouldn't exist. Through centuries of turbulence, they have successfully forged their own distinct, modern identity.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider how this long, turbulent journey from a frontier island of indigenous tribes to a heavily colonized outpost to a modern democratic powerhouse informs the geopolitical headlines we see right now. The legacy of resistance and the hard-won fight for self-determination are baked deeply into Taiwan's DNA. How will this deeply forged identity influence the island's future on the world stage? Thanks so much for joining me, and as always, keep questioning the history behind the headlines.